What's going on, everybody? I am on Las Vegas Boulevard in Las Vegas, Nevada. I am just up the street from the Mandalay Bay, if I can find it right there. That's Mandalay Bay. That is where they had the active shooter incident in 2017 that took 59 lives with over 500 other people injured. And what happens after some sort of incident is the trauma, which resonates for years and years on people. We're going to speak today as part of our podcast about a trauma victim who was actually a police officer at an active shooter incident, and I think you're really going to find it interesting. Thanks for joining us. MANBROSIA starts soon. All right, guys, thank you so much for joining us. This is the MANBROSIA podcast. It is an authentic exploration of men's health, wellness, masculinity, and relationships. So we've got Jorey Herrscher in the house. Excuse me, I keep funneling up your name.
It's all right.
But we are talking, Jorey and I have been friends for a while now, and he has an amazing backstory, history of what he went through and some challenges he went through and how he's really plowed through them in an amazing way and added so much value to a lot of other people's lives. But give us a little backstory, Jorey, on what you went through and how that impacted your life and how the traumatic experience unfolded.
Sure. So, give you a little, probably a little further back history than what you're thinking. As I explored PTSD is what it started off as, but as I explored trauma and I explored what causes trauma and how we overcome trauma, I realized that most people who suffer from PTSD, so that sphere of the world is mostly soldiers, right, or military members.
That's what you naturally assume it or associate it with, right?
That's what most people assume it is, and rightfully so, in that that's where the study comes from. Everything we know about PTSD started off with treating Vietnam veterans. And so,
was it diagnosed that early on, the PTSD? Was there an awareness of it in the field?
Yes, it was not called, well, there was actually an awareness before that. It was called shell shock.
Oh, gotcha.
From World War I. But they didn't really have a good grasp of what it actually was. And so it wasn't until a very famous psychologist, Dr. van der Kolk, began to look at these Vietnam soldiers. He knew that there was a difference between those who came home from World War II and those who came home from Vietnam. And he couldn't really figure out, what the difference was, but he decided I'm going to figure it out. And so,
there was obviously traumatic experiences at both locations.
Oh, sure. And there's traumatic, any war, right? Really any conflict, there's going to be some sort of trauma. And don't get me wrong, when I say trauma, I'm not talking about only the trauma that leads to post-traumatic stress or anxiety or a mental breakdown or anything. We all experience trauma.
Sure.
And the brain is built to handle that trauma. But at some point, there are some of us that are not able to work through that trauma all the way by ourselves. And that's what ends up manifesting itself as post-traumatic stress. But I bring that up because the VA did a study on young men and women, but mostly young men coming home from war. You'd have two guys that were in the same group, in the same scenario, same everything, except for when they got home, one would have severe PTSD and the other one would have apparently not no symptoms, but a lot less.
Seem to have managed it.
They seem to have managed it better. And so they started thinking, maybe these gentlemen, ladies and gentlemen who ended up developing post-traumatic stress disorder, they had a weaker constitution or whatever it might be. Sure. And so they started doing studies on it, and what they actually found was that those who were diagnosed with post-traumatic stress disorder had unresolved earlier trauma. And so this was just one, the straw that broke the camel's back.
Interesting.
Basically. And so, and the ones who didn't experience that trauma, or if they did experience trauma, they were able to correctly mitigate the negative consequences really of that trauma.
Because everyone at some point, trauma can I mean, small things could impact people in a traumatic way, and obviously bigger things can have a huge impact as well.
And let me also make a couple things clear. I'm not a doctor, I'm not a psychologist, I'm not a counselor. This is just my learning and my experience, so I don't claim it to be anything other than just my opinion and my experience. So.
Absolutely.
But back to the reason I told you that is because I didn't know that I had early childhood trauma until I started to investigate the police trauma. And so I tell you all that to tell you this. When it started, when I was a kid, that's when it started.
Okay.
When it really started to manifest itself was after my brief stint in law enforcement. So
let's hear about that.
Yeah, so I started in law enforcement in 2006. Went through the police academy. If you're not familiar, you go to this classroom version of the academy, and once you graduate from that, you go into what's referred to as the FTO program. This is when you ride with a seasoned police officer and you learn the ropes. Basically.
FTO stands for Field Training
Officer.
Okay.
Right. So I was on FTO. I had gone through my entire FTO process. The last week of FTO, different agencies call it different things. Some call it Ghost Week, some call it Test Week, and they call it Ghost Week because typically at least at this time, your trainer would wear plain clothes, and so the only officer in the car was the trainee.
So they're riding in the back seat, like they got apprehended, or
they look like a ride along.
Okay.
They're riding in the front seat. Typically they have a vest on, but they look like a ride along.
Makes me laugh.
They don't look like a police officer.
Yeah.
So my very last night on FTO, this was my test night. This was kind of is he gonna make it kind of moment.
Sure. Yeah.
And my FTO and I had become pretty good friends at that point. We were able to joke around and whatnot. It was a slow night. It was a boring night, and we made jokes about, you don't ever say in law enforcement, and I guess in military, any first responder gig, you don't ever say, "Boy, it's slow." It's just a curse right there. But so we kept away from that. But what he did end up saying was that if something didn't happen, he was going to have to fail me. We're going to have to start all over again. And he ate his words later because. We went to a call. We were just trying to get something. There wasn't even any traffic to do a traffic stop on. So I had a buddy in my academy class with me that was making a traffic stop, and we're gonna go help. Just something to put a stat on the board. And so we go to help him out, and he says, "No, I don't need any help." And I already called a tow truck and everything. And so we're just okay. Well, let's go. We go to get back in the car, and the two of us had just gotten in the car. I was driving. And we got different agencies have different ways of notifying its police officers, but in the jurisdiction I was in, they call it the triple beep. You get this 3 beep, 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 and it just means everybody stop what you're doing and listen, because this is going out to everybody, whether you're on a call or not. And the beep, beep, beep was a shots fired around a mall. And it was almost, when I heard that, it was almost just like oh brother, because this was a more dangerous part of town, and shots fired in that area was not uncommon. It's the gang wars and all this junk, and so blew it off. And we get to the car.
Oh, so it's kind of expected in this part of town. There's going to be shots.
There's going to be shots fired. We're going to get there. We're not going to find anything.
Right.
We won't even find a shell. We won't find a victim. They shoot in the air, they shoot at houses, and it's over.
Yeah.
Let the day shift guys in the morning get the call that a bullet went through someone's wall. And yes, police are that cynical. So my FTO says, "Tell them we'll grab it, we'll go do a drive around, find out that they're gone, and we'll clear it." So I get on the radio and I said, that we'll be en route, we'll take that call. And so I flipped around, and we had only just barely flipped around going the other direction when we had another triple beep. And it was man seen entering mall with rifle. And the hair just stood up on the back of my neck. I looked at my FTO, and he said, "Oh, we need to go." And so I stepped on it. Lights and sirens at that point, and which is really, if police officers really tell the truth, that's like one of the best parts, running lights and sirens to a call. But I don't remember feeling all that cool in that moment. It was a scary feeling, and the follow-up was a third triple beep and said, there's a man down, confirmed active shooter at the mall. And this trip, I was only maybe 7 blocks from the mall, and it felt like it took me an hour to get there. It just was the slowest drive. I'm sure I was going, I won't say how fast I was going fast.
So like it's pure adrenaline kicking in, even at this stage, early
just
on.
Pure adrenaline at this point.
Which is a precursor to traumatic experiences, right?
Sure, and don't get me wrong, that was the correct response. That was what the body is trained and designed to do, right? So in that moment you get the fight, flight, and freeze. Very few people talk about the freeze, but freeze is just as common as fight or flight.
Right.
But I had just been trained into being fight. You know, you whether I had it before or not, I did have it. I leaned towards the fight anyway, and so then going through the police academy and being on FTO, it definitely solidified the fight in me. So I pulled up to the mall and walked into my very first major call as a police officer while I was still in training as an active shooter in a mall. Ended up killing numerous people, wounding way more. And when I was 15 feet from the guy when he was killed. And so when I approached him, it's police protocol, he still handcuffed the guy. Ended up being an 18-year-old kid. And we had a report of a second shooter. And so I spent the next 6 hours with a rifle or a shotgun, it was way too heavy, walking this mall looking for the second bad guy who wasn't there. What had happened is there was 2 separate descriptions of the same guy.
Reported separately.
Because he had on a tan coat and a backpack with a shotgun, and now he also had a pistol, but when he took his backpack off, he stripped his overcoat, and so then he was wearing white t-shirt and jeans with a pistol, and we got 2 different descriptions. So
right, yeah.
That was it. I went home. I think that was my police talk here. That was my Friday, meaning that I didn't have work the next day. It was my Saturday, Sunday.
Mm-hmm. Wait, let me ask you a couple questions at this stage.
Yeah, go for it.
Were you, having gone through that, were you feeling anything other than the adrenaline the entire time, or were you having even a moment to think about what you were experiencing or what you were witnessing, or was it just was the trauma of the experience like encompassing this whole? Was it a 3-hour, 2-hour ordeal plus the 6 hours you were looking for someone?
It was 8 minutes and 25 seconds.
Oh my gosh!
Until that guy was down, but then afterwards it was 6 hours of searching buildings and clearing stores, and so let me back up. Your question. I got out of the car, and at that point my adrenaline was in full kick, but I had a moment to pause because I had to get my shotgun out of the trunk of the car. So I had to run behind the car, grab my shotgun, shut the trunk, and my FTO was gone. He had run one of the 2 directions. I didn't know which direction he had gone. And so it crossed my mind for a split second that it was I either had to find him or I had to go do my job. And I chose to do my job, and I ended up running to the right. He had gone to the left, and I didn't see my FTO again until the end of the night. So I ran in the other side of the building, and as soon as I realized he was gone, that was it. Adrenaline and training fortunately took over.
Right. Yeah.
And so I didn't feel or really think of anything other than just what my training had taught me at that point, until I saw him, the bad guy, dead. And at that point, I stepped past him, and we started searching for the second shooter. And at that point, when I realized that he was gone, he'd been stopped, I started to come down a little bit. And my senses started coming back. And part of the trauma on it was I could smell a mix of blood and gunpowder. And that was a trigger for me for a long time, those smells.
Combined, or just the fact you could smell gunpowder or blood at any given time, and that would trigger it?
It had to be combined at first, and then as time went on, it didn't really gunpowder and blood didn't really bother me after that until much later on when I was doing EMDR, which I know we're going to get into. But I had a pet that threw up blood, and it completely triggered me.
Really?
And took me right back to Trolley Square, which was crazy because it had been years since I had any
Trolley
issues
Square
with it.
being the mall.
Trolley Square was the mall. Yeah, that's right.
So let me ask you. Let me jump to that point real quick. So when you said it triggered you, you took you right back to that space. I mean, describe what happens or what's happening when you have this kind of. Is it a relapse or is it a what do you refer to it as?
Yeah. So the word trigger I hated for a long time because it's kind of been stolen by a generation who doesn't understand what triggering or what trauma actually is.
Mm-hmm.
But a trigger is, so I'm gonna have to scoot back a little bit further than that even. So trauma is kind of an imprint on our emotional brain, right? You've got the emotional memory and then you've got what I call the movie memory. They're actually stored, if you will, just stay with me for a second, but they're stored in two different places in our brain, right? And the movie memory, our brain can sometimes hide or dull. Maybe you can't completely hide it, but some things you will. You'll completely forget. But the emotional memory, it's not able to hide. And what'll happen is years after a traumatic event,
It's like dormant in our brains just for years, or
Yep, it could be years, it could be months, it could be days, but
Interesting.
what happens is it lays dormant, and then something will happen in our current day that will make us feel a certain way, and a certain emotion will get evoked. That emotion, what our brain does is it jumps back into our memories, and it says, when have I felt like this before? Because that's how we survive. Our brain goes back to the amygdala, the fight, flight, or freeze world, and says, when did I last feel like this? What did I do to survive then? What did I do wrong? What can I do better now? And it runs through all these scenarios.
That's an interesting point because I hear that repeated over and over and over again about how our brains are wired primarily to protect us.
Yes.
And so our responses, our abilities to like get past that, it's going to take a deliberate effort on our parts, because if we just fall into our natural tendency of what our brain wants us to do, it's going to be to never to take the risk. It's going to be to always protect yourself. It's always going to be to pull back and hesitate, let someone else go first to try, which obviously impedes our abilities in a lot of ways to just simply maximize our lives.
Sure.
So there's a lot of ways that can encompass us.
Absolutely. And one of the examples I give is we've got certain functions in our body that we have zero control over. Our heartbeat is one of them. We can't sit here and think and change our heartbeat. That's not how that works. Our brain makes our heart beat, and we're glad for it because it keeps us alive, right? But then there's ones that our bodies will not do unless we think about it. Lifting a hand, for example, that's completely voluntary. But then you've got ones that are in between that are both involuntary and voluntary. If I tell you that breathing is involuntary, your breath will get messed up just by saying that.
Right.
Because we can think about it, we can change our breath. We can hold our breath, we can breathe faster, slower, and our memories are the same way. Our brains are the same way. We've got certain memories that we can't control, certain ones that we can control, and then you got ones in the middle where you've decided.
So what happened then that you were triggered with your dog?
A trigger is when, like I said before, when it grabs the situation you're in, it evokes a feeling, and then it jumps back to find when it was familiar. Mm-hmm. That feeling was familiar. So my dog threw up blood, and she was sick, and it was a mess. And so my wife was taking care of the dog and getting the kids out of the room, and I said, I'll go clean it up. And went and got paper towels and everything, went to go clean up the blood. And when I moved it, the smell hit me in the face. And it was weird because it had been a long time since I'd had an actual flashback. Flashbacks are one of the triggering results.
Okay.
A trigger is just the reaching back. But this one was all emotional and all physiological, but nothing in my memory, nothing in my mind's eye.
So you weren't visualizing the flashback, but you were feeling it.
Everything.
And it was fear? Was it anger? What was the...
All of the above. So anyone who says that they run into a situation like that and don't feel fear, they're either lying or they're a sociopath. It's just, there's just no other way.
Right, yeah. And not everyone may understand what a sociopath is, and that's someone who has the inability to feel emotions
exactly.
and connections.
Exactly.
Most people who are
serial
killers, exactly. Sociopaths, right?
Yeah, they're sociopaths. They don't have the ability to feel empathy.
Almost like they don't have a conscience or something.
Right. Yeah, they just don't care. They don't have the emotions, or at least they do have emotions. They're dulled, but they really don't have empathy.
Right. So anyway, didn't mean to digress there.
No, you're okay. So what it was that came back was all the feelings that I had during the shooting, and then all the feelings that I had attributed to that since then. So fear, fear for me, but fear for other people. And then the fear of, I got a wife who was pregnant with our first child at the time. Is my first child going to grow up without a dad? All that. Anger at the world. Man, I was mad at the world for a long time.
But in that moment, you had the relapse or the trigger.
All of it. And it all came from that smell.
Okay, so you smelled it, you felt it. What'd you do?
I froze.
You did freeze.
That was the first time. I backed off a little bit. I had when you hit the fight or flight, you get the tunnel vision is one of the symptoms of that. You get the isolated hearing loss. It kind of muffles. You feel like you're hearing things underwater. I had that, the flushed face, the fast, heartbeat, and I kind of stood back and I couldn't move too fast because I thought I was going to pass out. And I'm embarrassed at this point. This is happening to me. I turn around and my wife is standing there.
Oh, she'd been right there.
She was watching the whole thing.
Oh my gosh.
And she said, "You okay?" And I said, "I'm fine, but I need to go sit down." And she goes, "I thought that might happen." And she jumped in and cleaned it up.
Really? Your wife recognized that might be an instant or a catalyst for you to respond.
Yes, and even more than that, I started to trigger way before I realized it. But she's watched me for so many years. She saw the moment that I triggered, and I didn't realize it until everything caught up to me.
So this response was pretty much all internal. There were no external. You weren't yelling. You weren't angry. Nope. You weren't curling up in a ball. Everything was inside.
It was all inside, in my head, in my body.
Because that's interesting. Because I think there's a lot of perceptions of like what that would look like if someone has an experience like that, a traumatic relapse, and so the fact that it's all internalized, and perhaps unless someone knows you really well, they may not even recognize it's happening. I think that's a key component that we can kind of be aware of, to recognize that just because it's not something that you would perceive like in a movie or something. Yeah, it doesn't mean that's not happening.
The scenes in movies where, it's always the Vietnam soldier, right? They always portray these poor guys like that, but where they have a trigger, something triggers a memory, and they go back to the war, and they're in Saigon, or they're in, and they're back in the jungle, and that happens. Don't get me wrong, but it happens way, 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 way less than people.
But it's the emotions you felt in those moments, in those experiences that are being,
and that's
came right to the surface.
That's right. And there's flashbacks, and then there are living back in that scene. So I had flashbacks all the time. But what these flashbacks were is they were instantaneous.
So it's a memory with like an intense feeling associated with it.
Right. Okay. And then the feelings, the fight or flight emotions start to take over. You start to feel the adrenaline rush. You start to feel the cortisol rush. You start to feel the quickness of breath, or the quickness of the heartbeat and the shortness of breath. You'll feel all that, but it comes much later. So what happens is, if you can imagine, you're watching a movie and someone's walking in the park, and then the director has it cut to a scene of a war and then cut right back.
Right.
It's less than a second. That I experience those all the time, and not just from that event. It was from multiple things. A lot of things happened to me in law enforcement. A lot of things that I saw had nothing to do with law enforcement growing up, but it was that event that triggered really my slide into post-traumatic stress. And
so let's talk on the subject in a different way. So what other traumatic events have you found in talking with people, or because you've ended up speaking to groups of people, of police officers and different groups, soldiers,
Right.
and you've spoken about your experience in order to guide them through a process of recovery, because you've evolved through a recovery process.
Right.
And what are some of the other experiences that, you know, we may not all be aware of are traumatic inducing experiences?
Sure. So I tell everybody that you cannot base your trauma off of what other people have experienced. And by the way, that's a symptom of trauma, is to mitigate your trauma in your mind because it's not as bad as his or it's not as bad as hers. There's a lot of things that can be traumatic, right? Car accidents traumatize a lot of people. Industrial accidents, accidents at home, of course, assaults, sexual assaults especially. Anything that we are left to feel vulnerable, either in our own mortality or our own safety, that comes unexpected.
So here, let me interject this. So, you know, speaking about this whole purpose of these podcasts that I do specifically are about, you know, men's health awareness and such, and men are horrible at accepting a limitation within themselves.
Absolutely.
We are horrible at like being willing to even explore the fact that, you know, we're struggling with something, especially if it's upstairs. You know, if like we got a bloody finger or something, we can show off. We're like, I got all cut up, so that's why I'm not playing baseball. You know, but to come back with something like, I got something going on, man, upstairs, and that's why I'm not hanging out with you guys. It's like, we feel like a shame or a hesitation to engage like that, right?
Yeah, we don't do it.
So, what was your path out of that, or at least that you're on now, or that you've gone through to really mitigate your experience? I mean, to minimize the impacts and the relapses.
So the average amount of time it takes somebody to seek help is 10 years. And it was almost exactly 10 years.
That's a lot of wasted time, man.
It's a lot of wasted time.
Lesson number one, if you can shortcut this, if you're listening to this and you feel you might have some trauma, lesson number one. I mean, I'm talking to these bonehead guys out there because I'm one of them. Jorey was one of them. Dude, talk to someone, email, text me. Let's talk through it and let's see if this is like something that, you know, qualifies, because quit minimizing this stuff. Okay,
right.
I have to say that. Go.
No, that's great. And you're right that the process that our brain goes through to heal trauma, it starts naturally, and it is always helpful. I guess I'll say that it is always helpful to talk to somebody who can help you through the process. An educated person. I'm talking about a counselor. Right. I'm talking about a psychiatrist, psychologist.
So you say talk to, like, actually going to like a talk therapy, or just getting some feedback on the tools and resources available?
Well, I think either one is beneficial, but talk therapy is huge. And I think we need to get away from the stigma and the stereotype of talk therapy. All right, it's not a kumbaya session. It's not everybody hold hands and sing songs, which is how I grew up. That's what I thought counseling was. Right. But what it is it's talking to somebody who understands how the brain works, understands how powerful our emotions are, and how to navigate through those hurdles. And so even if you don't end up with post-traumatic stress, there is a precursor to post-traumatic stress that is acute stress disorder, is what it's called. And it's not actually, well, they call it disorder. It's actually not a disorder yet. It is when a traumatic event has not been appropriately rectified within a certain amount of time. You go into a state called acute stress disorder. And then if that's not rectified, it becomes PTSD. And
what are the symptoms of acute stress that aren't
the exact same as post-traumatic stress?
It's
just earlier on, because really the key to avoiding post-traumatic stress is to intervene early on, just to stop the cycle. The definition of PTSD is literally that these are the symptoms and it's gone on too long. They weren't resolved. And so, but I do have to talk real quick about, because you're going to have people write you about this, because I keep saying post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD. There's PTSD, there's PTSI, there's post-traumatic stress injury, there's some PTS. Some people just call it post-traumatic stress. I don't mean to offend anyone by using any of those terms. I use post-traumatic stress disorder because that's what I was diagnosed with, and because it is the disorder that actually gives us protection in our jobs and in our livelihood. And so I'm a big proponent of, I don't feel like it's a disorder. I feel like it's an injury. So I'm probably more inclined to call it post-traumatic stress.
But it's there. It's given to us by our genetic makeup purposefully.
Yes, that's right. And the law protects us because it's a disorder. So anyway, that's just to clarify that. To answer your question a few seconds ago, 10 years after that mall shooting, my life had gotten progressively worse, much, much worse. Things that were already, I think, negatives in my life were just expanded upon. It just became intolerable, basically.
If you don't mind getting a little vulnerable, I mean, like, what were some of the specifics? And I say this not to try to, like,
no, I don't mind talking about
yourself, because I think so many of us as men specifically are so hesitant to talk about it, but to hear another guy say, like, oh yeah, I had a really screwed up marriage, or I had a really screwed up relationship,
Yeah.
I argued with my kids, or whatever it is. I mean,
Yep.
like, how was it manifest in your life?
So mine was always a lack of self-confidence, and that comes from super young. And
okay, so just so we're clear on this, Jorey is this, like, what are you, like 6 foot
6 feet, yeah.
6 foot tall, beautiful blue eye guy. I mean, my wife, she goes, oh, you got beautiful blue eyes. I'm like, dude, slow down, cowgirl. I mean, he's got every reason. He's strong, good looking, beautiful family, to be confident. And so that explained by him that he was going through that. I mean, a lot of us would just see him on the street and be like, dude, you're nuts. But that's what happens on the inside of a lot of us as men, is like, we don't see ourselves as everyone else sees us. We see ourselves as this, like, diminished version of a caricature who we just kind of imagine ourselves to be, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And it's self-inflicted. And that one of my favorite sayings, and a lot of people have said this, I don't know who to give it credit to, but I love this quote. It says that we didn't choose the trauma, but the healing is our responsibility. Right? The trauma is not our choice, wasn't our option, wasn't something we did to ourselves, but healing is our responsibility. And I think it's the same way with confidence, with self-appreciation, with relationships. It doesn't just magically get better. Right? It's an actual decision, and then it's a conscious effort to improve.
Okay, so and this is, I agree completely with what you're saying. And there are resources and tools out there now to do it, but without knocking a few doors or asking a few questions, which most of us as men aren't willing or really know how to do, we're going to sit there in the dark for so much of our time. But yeah, it is our responsibility. I mean, dude, I hope this falls on ears that need this, because this is powerful information.
Well, and it really is. It changed my life, literally, saved my life, literally. But that's one of the reasons why I'm so passionate about it. That's why I speak. I'm a paid speaker. I'm a paid international speaker, but I do a lot of charity speaking too, because it's just so important that this falls on all ears, right? Mm-hmm. That when I say that the trauma was not our choice, but healing is our obligation, right? It's our, it's on us. It's not going to fix it by itself. When I say that, I don't say that to diminish other people, or to say that, that you're hurting because, it's your fault. You're choosing to be hurting. That's not what I'm saying. I'm saying that the healing process happens when you decide to make it happen. If you don't know about that, then you sit there and you suffer the consequences. So getting this out is just as important as actually going through the steps of healing. Letting people understand that that's a truth. It's not something I'm not making up. It's not something that's an opinion. It's the truth. It's psychologically correct.
It's hard to get to that point, man. But
it's very hard to get to that point.
Did you find a brotherhood or a group of men, or was it your wife, or how did you who were your cheerleaders getting you through this point?
I wish that I had.
Was the police backing you up on stuff? Were there psychologists who met with you there?
No. See, and we're doing better. I will start with that. But law enforcement, first responders in general, firefighters, EMS, nurses, by the way, who are first responders. Those agencies are horrible about dealing with emotional trauma, with post-traumatic stress and mental health. Absolutely horrible. And the reason for that is because this massive fear of liability. You know, a police officer shoots somebody, God forbid, and they find out that they've been seeing a psychiatrist. That's not going to go well. And so for a police officer and even a firefighter, EMS, whatever, to openly admit that they're having mental health issues, they're blackballed. They're losing their job. They will find some reason to fire you. And I have talked with...
That's crazy. What a catch-22.
Dozens and dozens and dozens of police officers from all over this world, as far as London, England, I've talked to on the phone about this, and it's a universal truth.
You know, and it's interesting you bring this up because there's such a theme, and this is another podcast for another day, about men who struggle with whatever it may be. It's like there's such a stigma attached to exposing that.
Right.
That can affect your job, it can affect your relationships, it can affect your reputation, that they don't do it. And so, you know, all we can do is demonize them after it's exposed in the public eye.
Yeah.
And I've spoken in depth with a lot of people about that, and there's got to be a solution out there, but it has to be embracing people in their struggle, in their natural best effort, and kind of like giving them grace as well as allowing them to, you know, just be expose their humanity, but still allow them to exist in the same plane.
Right, and including giving them time to heal.
Absolutely.
You know, it's anyway.
Time to heal, time to confess, time to exist without being demonized for...
Right, and I think honestly so you asked me before who my cheerleader group was.
Yeah.
I had my wife, who has always been my biggest cheerleader, but at that point in my life I couldn't see her for what she was. I got to a point, I got to such a dark place that I made an attempt on my life. I attempted suicide in 2017.
Was it from like a downward spiral, or was it like a spontaneous kind of feeling like I got nothing else to go for?
It was a downward spiral, but the decision to take my life was spontaneous. It was just a moment of opportunity, and I decided to take it. So what actually happened to get me diagnosed was I've always wanted to do military. I've always seen myself as a soldier or a Marine. Actually, I wanted to be a Marine. I was in the Marine Corps recruiting process when I met my wife, and I chose to marry my beautiful wife rather than to go into the military service, and I've never regretted that. But I've also always wanted to do the military.
Sure.
And so I left law enforcement, went to law school. I'm an attorney now in Texas. And after that, I realized that there might be a place for me in the JAG Corps, becoming an attorney for the military branches. So I applied, and I was accepted into the Air Force JAG Corps. And I went out to San Antonio for my on-base interview. It could not have gone better. And I was super excited. I'm going to be an Air Force JAG officer. And that led to a discussion, not that itself, some other stuff had happened too, but my wife and I ended up getting in an argument. And I knew there was a major problem, and I just knew that the problem was her. And I told her that we were going to counseling, and we went to counseling, and I found out the problem was not her. Found out it was in fact me. We sat down to our first marital counseling session, and
it's kind of ironic that the only reason you even were willing to go to counseling is because you were trying to show that she was off.
Right. I was trying to save my marriage in a backhanded way.
Yeah.
You know, I was certain it was her fault.
Yeah.
But the marriage counselor, you know, he within minutes knew that there was something wrong with me, and about 15 minutes into it, I'd realized he was only talking to me, and I snapped at him. I said, you know, we're here for couples counseling. You want to talk to her, or should I ask her to step out? And he kind of went, I think we're done. And he says, I can't help you. He's like, but I know someone who can. He referred me to another counselor who was an expert in post-traumatic stress, and I met with her. I think it was like 2 days later. My wife thinks it was like a week later.
Wait, so like even in that short conversation, the whole the stress, the indicators of the PTSD, they were more manifest enough that they were able to pull.
They were incredibly apparent. Now that I know what those behaviors are, that's one of the curses and blessings of being diagnosed with PTSD. Once you're diagnosed with that, you can diagnose it in other people.
Right.
And
Yeah.
Don't sue me. I'm not diagnosing people, but I can sense it in people.
Yeah.
When they start to talk a certain way. Dude, you got some trauma in you, and I'll make a referral. I'll call them out on it.
Right. And maybe, I mean, men are probably not so good at embracing that, but once they get their head around it, I mean, maybe it's good. I mean, maybe because they start to sense that within themselves. Now, there's so much stuff I'd like to talk to you about, but for the sake of timing on this on this discussion and such,
sure.
You go to therapy. Some of it works, some of it doesn't as much as you like, but you get recommended to try EMDR, which stands for
eye movement EMDR, eye movement desensitization reprogramming.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. And so, how long has EMDR been around? Are you aware of this?
1987.
So it's fairly recent.
Right.
And within studies, I studied this in grad school.
Uh-huh.
I'm actually a therapist intern right now. So I'm an intern. My kid, 48 years old.
Awesome.
And the interesting thing about it is that it sounds almost science fiction.
Yeah.
Superficial on the surface.
Yeah.
But the idea that they can have a flashing light bar in front of you and speak to things that would normally induce a trauma or a response, or is that how it works out? I've only seen them do it on video. I've never been to an actual session myself or received one. So what do they speak to you? How does it go down, and what's the intended response, and how long did it take for that response to happen with you?
Yeah, all great questions. So EMDR is basically, we all know what REM is, right? The rapid eye movement. It's this phase of sleep where our eyes will jump back and forth, right?
Right.
We know very little about sleep compared to what is actually out there. But one thing we do know is that during that REM cycle, that's taking the memories from today that's in the prefrontal cortex, and it's putting it in long-term storage, sticking it back in long-term memory. And so whatever that eye movement is doing, we don't know exactly. There's theories out there. If there's been a scientific breakthrough and I don't know about it, don't kill me, but we really don't know exactly what's going on. We just know that that's what happens. Well, as I spoke before about the two different movie memory and the emotional memory, that's why people with post-traumatic stress or just severe trauma, that's why we have such bad nightmares and horrible sleep and night terrors. Night terrors are scary. I suffered from those for years. But the reason for that is because if anything happened during the day that in any way resembles any traumatic thing that you've been through, when you go to sleep, it opens up that path between the prefrontal cortex and the long-term storage, and those memories pass. You revisit it.
Interesting.
So what EMDR is it's triggering that rapid eye movement, and it's opening that bridge between current state and our long-term storage.
That's interesting. That so by making your eye follow the light, it's stimulating the connection.
Yes.
That allows that to happen, but in a more controlled state. That allows it to, I guess, devolve from the intensity that it might have been on its own.
Right, and really the goal, so you're never going to get rid of the traumatic event, right? That's not going away. It's in the past. It happened. We're not getting rid of it. What we can do, though, is, so trauma is actually put away. Trauma's a memory, right? That's what it is. It's an emotional memory, and it's a movie memory. And it's put away at the age we were when we suffered that trauma. So if you suffered a trauma at the age of 8, your memory is an 8-year-old. And so when you feel that panic, people who almost drown, who now they can't be around water. Have you ever noticed, I'm going to back off real quick. Have you ever noticed that when people who are dealing with trauma, they almost take a childlike state during a panic attack, during an anxiety attack, whatever it is, they take a childlike state. The reason behind that is because our emotions are literally a child status, right? That's why someone in their 40s who falls in love for the first time in 20 years acts like a child. That's why, Mission Impossible jumped on the couch on the Oprah show, because our emotions are juvenile, they're childish. And so when the the girl who fell into a pool and almost drowned sees a pool in her 40s or 50s and panics and has this completely irrational response to getting in the water, that's why. She's not reacting to the water right here in front of her. She's reacting to that situation and that emotion that's been around since she was 8 years old. And so what EMDR does is it recalls that memory, and it allows you to process that memory not as an 8-year-old, but as however old you are, as an adult.
So no one's talking, there's no hypnosis, there's nothing going on there that's trying to talk you down. It's just you're revisiting this memory and the fact that you're handling it or reviewing it as a mature adult without any of the other chemical imbalances associated with, the impeded emotional state.
Sure, exactly. That's exactly it. And it
seems so simple on the surface, yet it obviously is very impactful. It's worked for hundreds of thousands of individuals.
Absolutely. And it does seem simple, and it's one of those things where it's simple but hard. It's simple in its design and understanding, but the actual ability to do it is difficult, right? It's I joke around.
The ability to do it, like the ability for someone to perform an EMDR, or the ability to actually let it change you?
Both.
Oh, really?
So EMDR
it's not a slam dunk. It's not a for sure. Okay.
Not at all. EMDR is extremely dangerous in the wrong hands. It's just like a surgeon, right? That's why not all doctors are surgeons. Once you become a doctor, you're a doctor. If you want to become a surgeon, you go back to school and you do some more studying. EMDR is much the same way. Just because you're a counselor, and this is this is maybe a little bit off topic, but it's one of the things I have against EMDR is right now there's no really requirement. There's no extra licensing. There is mandatory training, but it's like...
Yeah, there's people who are certified in it and such.
Yes,
but
it's not hard to get that certification once you're a counselor. And so I've had really bad EMDR experiences.
Oh, really?
I've had really, really good ones.
How many EMDR clinicians have you had
3.
give you EMDR? Okay.
I've had 7 counselors. And by the way, I'll throw a pitch out for this too. I joke around that getting your counselor is a lot like finding a pair of shoes that you like. You don't try on one pair of shoes and take them, right? Just because you go to a counselor and you don't mesh, that doesn't mean the counselor is not going to be offended by that. It's not going to be. Just find someone that works for you. So don't give up just because your first experience is not amazing.
And not to digress, but that can be hard for men because men are kind of like, dude, they're not in the mood to do it in the first place.
Exactly.
And now have to put out extra effort for it, man, bull crap.
It costs money. A lot of times insurance companies don't pay for it like they should. And so, but yeah, don't give up. So
yeah.
But going back to it, the EMDR, I went to, my final experience with EMDR was a phenomenal counselor who I recommend to way more people than she can take. And her experience with EMDR was that she went to the training and got certified and went, there's way more to this than that. I can't do this in clear conscious. And so she went on her own and went and did a deep dive and became an absolute expert on.
And she was
EMDR.
here in Texas, or
yeah, she's in the Woodlands.
Okay.
And which, if you want to send a message, I will gladly refer her. She's amazing.
Yeah, I'll put the link to connect with you. In the
absolutely
podcast.
But she's the one who taught me a lot about, probably the most about EMDR. Between that and I read Dr. Van der Kolk, The Body Keeps the Score. Phenomenal book. But between that and this counselor, that's where I got most of my own experiences. That's where I got my EMDR knowledge.
So how many sessions, how many years or how many months before you felt a difference in your in your cognitive awareness of dealing with a moment that might typically be a relapse for you?
Yeah, so my first experience with EMDR, I jokingly call it the best worst experience of my entire life. It's rough. EMDR is rough because it's opening up these raw places, and it's making you face those, and nobody wants to face those. So it was rough. And when
are the questions just very pointed? Are they? I mean, or how did the counselor open it up?
So EMDR, and I'm gonna way oversimplify this. Okay. So, but after you get done listening to me, you don't know how EMDR works. I'm just gonna try to lay it out simply. Okay. So EMDR is they get the REM state going. They do it with a light. They can do it with sound. I used they're like these vibrating eggs. You put one in each hand, and the vibrations go from one hand to the other. It doesn't have. We think it's eye movement, but really what it is it's getting it's going left brain, right brain, left brain, right brain, and that moving back and forth opens the bridge. Moving our eyes does that. That's why I think in our sleep we have REM.
Okay.
But you can do it with auditory. You can do it with headphones on. There's a bunch of different ways you can do it. The first time I did it, I literally followed a finger, which was extremely distracting to me because I was a police officer, and this tells me DWI. So I finally told him I can't do the finger. That makes me feel like I'm being tested for DWI. But what it does is when it opens that up, all they do is they ask a question that is going to be suggestive. You've already had a meeting and you've already talked about things that are hard for you, and so all they're going to do is ask you a question that just brings up that topic. And you don't have to close your eyes. I chose to because it was a lot less distracting. After I started using the vibrating tools, I could close my eyes and just not see anything, not be distracted. But then what ends up happening is, like I said before, when a traumatic event happens or when you trigger, your brain jumps back. It digs into its archives, goes far back as it can remember. It wants to remember the very first time you felt that way. It's the same thing during EMDR. So what'll happen is you will think of a feeling that you had, like an emotional reaction you had or an event, and all of a sudden you'll jump to some event in your life, and it'll just feel like seriously, what? Like, why did I go to that? It makes no sense to your logical brain.
Sounds a little chaotic
It can feel chaotic. EMDR revealed memories that I had hidden, put it away, forgotten about, and it brought those back. That can be painful. It can bring back details of the traumatic event that you didn't remember had happened. That happened to me as well. But what happens is if you jump to that and then they'll say, okay, focus on that. You'll focus on whatever you just jumped to, and then your mind will jump somewhere else. Okay, now focus on that. And all they're doing is guiding you in your own recovery. That's what they're doing. And so they try to keep you on task, but this counselor that I owe my life to, she was really good at watching, and she'd say, you know what, we're going to stop for a minute, because she could see that I wasn't handling it well. I wasn't processing, and there's no point to continue if you're not processing.
Right.
So your first question, though, with the first counselor who did EMDR, I think I went probably 3 times, and I really didn't feel any different. And until probably about 2 weeks later, when I could look back on it and I could kind of see that I had progressed, and I went, oh, okay. So it was kind of an after realization. I tried EMDR with a counselor that I just did not jive with. That did not go well. And so I think I only went twice on that one. And then after I was able to really kind of process with this final counselor that I visited, I was able to process a lot of the police stuff with her. And once that was processed, I thought, well, I'm done, right? Now I'm good to go. Well, no, now that the police stuff's out of the way, now I started to jump back and I started to deal with stuff that happened in my childhood. And I just realized, man, I just started, I thought I had gone all this way, and really, which I had. I can't diminish
So
that.
how many years have you been doing EMDR now?
Probably 5.
Okay. Do you feel like you're at kind of towards the end of it, or do you feel like you got more down the pipeline?
No, I'm done with the MDR.
Okay.
I didn't know until I got to this final counselor. I didn't know if there was a finished, you know.
Is there, if someone out there is thinks like, okay, this might be a good fit for me to try, what are the qualifiers that you would like someone to know that it would be good for them, or if you have something in your life in a certain circumstance that maybe isn't a good fit, like what are some of the boxes that would check if you were trying to do this?
Really, you won't know until you try it.
So everyone should try it if they think they have a traumatic experience. That needs
My
exposure.
opinion is, I think everybody should try it.
Okay.
You should go to a counselor that has a good resume, right, on EMDR. I've heard of some pretty bad horror stories from people who did EMDR with a counselor that didn't know what they were doing, and so I don't want that to scare people away. Other than to just say, check their resumes. Just make sure this is somebody that's been doing it for a while. Make sure they've got some good training behind them. You know, educate yourself on EMDR and know how to ask questions.
So how would you rate yourself now, 5 years later, on a scale of 1 to 10? Where were you 5 years? Where are you at now? And where do you want to be? And how can you get there like 10 years from now? Are you feel like you have, at a place where you can maximize yourself, self-actualize, or do you feel like there's other places in your life that you can even grow further at this point?
I think we can always grow further. I think, where am I now compared to where I was? So I was unofficially diagnosed by a counselor, right? The counselor can't diagnose you, but the symptoms are so clear. I had a counselor tell me that I can't diagnose you, but you've got PTSD. That was in 2016. So that was 5 years ago, this October. I wasn't diagnosed until a year later because I attempted suicide. And I didn't tell anybody about it, didn't tell my wife about it. I knew that I had a suicide attempt. I decided to take my life. And in that same moment, I decided to not take my life. And both of them were very, I call them business decisions, right? There was no emotion involved, although that's not true. But it felt at the time.
In that moment, right?
That there was no, I wasn't sad, I wasn't upset. It was just this world's better without me. And I was driving home. It was dark. It was raining. It was right after pretty bad storm. Actually, this was right after Hurricane Harvey. Actually.
Wow.
And
do you think that was associated with the fact that was a hard time for a lot of people?
Oh, I'm sure that was a factor. But I was driving home. It was the sun was going down. It was getting kind of late. No one else was on the road, and a semi was coming towards me. And I've seen enough car accidents. I knew where to hit that semi, and I wasn't coming back. And so I swerved into his lane. I feel bad for the semi driver now, poor guy. I'm assuming it was a guy.
Wow.
But I swerved in front of him, ready to take that hit. And as soon as I did it, I said, they're going to know, they're going to figure out that I was a cop and that I know, and this was a suicide, and my wife's not going to get the insurance money. And so it was this panic that my family would not be taken care of. And so I swerved back, very much with the opinion that try again. This wasn't a saving my life. It was putting off the inevitable until I could come up with a better plan. And by the time I got home, I was in a full, what just happened?
Oh my gosh.
My came to my senses, I guess. And so I stayed up all night. I pretended like I was asleep, but I was not, because I was afraid if I fell asleep what I was going to see. And I called a psychiatrist office the next morning. They opened at 8, and I called at 7:57 and 7:58. The answering service kept being like, just wait till 8. And finally got on the phone, and I said, I need to make an appointment. And they said, we've got an opening in, I can't remember what it was, 4 weeks. We got an opening in 4 weeks. And I just paused, and she said, are you still there? And I said, ma'am, I won't be here in 6 weeks. And she says, look at that, I got an opening tomorrow. And she says, will you make it tomorrow? I said, you're going to make it? I said, yeah, I'll be there tomorrow. She said, "You promise you'll be here tomorrow?" I said, "Yes, ma'am." And that's when I was officially diagnosed by a doctor, psychiatrist, and then they gave me, different meds to help the PTSD, and they gave me sleeping medication, which was phenomenal because I hadn't slept in about a decade.
Wow.
So, but that's how it happened.
Well, listen, you've been very authentic and vulnerable, and you've shared some stuff that I think a lot of us, especially men, appreciate seeing that type of openness and that type of just willing to be honest and a little bit raw.
Sure.
And that means a lot, and I really appreciate that you came on and shared such things.
Yeah, no problem.
I want to ask you a couple questions to wrap
go for
up. Do you feel like your next step for you personally, after having gone through this journey and gone through what you did with your family and such, like what more can you do as a person, whether it's associated with this pathway you've gone? Because I do need to acknowledge the fact that now, in the show notes, we will put your information. If people want to access you or be able to reach out to you and ask you about what you've been through, because you do public speaking, you do coaching for PTSD, perhaps people who struggle,
right,
or whether they're military, whether they're first responder, or whether they're just human.
Right.
And you've been able to reach out to those, and
absolutely,
you've spoken to thousands of people to this point, and so I acknowledge you for your effort and your service for doing such a thing. So within that, or even outside of that, what is, two questions. Number one, what is your definition of authenticity? But before that, what do you think needs to happen in your life for you to embrace or feel like you're living a more authentic life for yourself?
That's a great question, and I think the reason I think that's such a great question is because all of us at some point, whether you've had a traumatic experience or not, all of us at some point have this doubt of our capabilities, right? We are by far our own worst enemies when it comes to that. Mm-hmm. And so you're authentic when you're not lying to yourself, mm-hmm, when you're not deceiving yourself. I talk a lot about the book of truths. We all have a book of truths in our mind or in our heart or however you want to put it. And unfortunately, some of those truths are false truths. They're not real. And so, but to us, inside our own heads, we can't see a difference. Gravity makes us fall, sky's blue, I'm a horrible person, right? They're all the same truth level in our minds. But that's why I think talk therapy is so good, because when you talk to somebody, someone who can listen to you verbalize this will go, wait, what? No, that's not true, right? I've talked to a lot of people who have a really hard time with self-worth, that if something traumatic happened to them, they must have done something wrong, there must be something wrong with them, they must be a bad person. And those are all trying to make sense of something you're not able to make sense about. Something happened to you because you were perpetrated upon, it's because you encountered an evil person in your life.
Right.
That's the answer. Has nothing to do with your value or any of that. So
it's not uncommon for people to absorb that into themselves and feel like they're responsible.
No, it's almost automatic.
Right.
I come across very few people who don't do that. So authenticity is, I became authentic with myself when I stopped lying to myself, right? And by lying, I also mean making excuses or justifying, all those things. You have to be 100% open and clear about your own limitations, about your own negative character traits, if you will, and be willing to not discuss them. I mean, I discuss them with everybody else. I made a very conscious decision. I can go stick a quarter on the floor in the building I was standing on when I decided that I was going to be just open and honest and just, air myself to the world, because it was so important to me. I understood that I was either going to hide it away, pretend it never happened, or I was going to take the complete opposite dramatic step and I was going to talk to everybody. Mm-hmm. And I've made a lot of people very uncomfortable by talking about uncomfortable things, but I don't care, because it's talking about uncomfortable things that helps us heal. So I think I just over-talked that. But the authenticity is when we stop lying to ourselves. We stop hiding things from ourselves. And our loved ones, those people around you, your rocks, right?
Yeah. Well, it sounds like it's giving you freedom. I mean, the experience, rather than holding you back, has actually propelled you to new opportunities to serve and give back to the world around you. So,
and you know, I decided my public speaking at first was selfish, because talking about it to other people was helping me, and it staved off the suicidal ideology when I was talking to other people about it, and when I was pretending like I was okay, right? It was selfish, but then at some point it turned into I was okay, and it was just this deep desire to make sure that other people were okay.
Interesting. So. Yeah, I think that's a good point to even conclude on, is the idea that just opening up and talking about it and being transparent with those around us, whether it's in a group or whether it's by someone close to you,
right?
It's all good. It's all helpful. It's all catharsis, perhaps.
It is, because even just talking to a therapist, right, or someone a complete stranger, sometimes when we say out loud what we're thinking, we hear ourselves say it and go, "Oh, that's crap." You know, that's not true. Because inside our head, inside our mind's eye, that makes sense. But then when we spit it out, our prefrontal cortex hears that and goes, "No, that's ridiculous." So that's why talk therapy is so effective for so many people, because you're airing all this stuff that you've kept inside. The second you say it, you'll know it's not true, and it's a powerful tool.
Interesting how that comes out, and you have that awareness right in that moment.
Right.
Interesting. Well, Jorey, it's been fascinating. I appreciate your time, and I appreciate the chance to talk with you on this type of podcast experience. And I look forward to doing it again in the future if you're open to that.
Absolutely, it was fun.
Yeah, and for anyone who would like to get a hold of Jorey and any of his expertise, where can they find you?
You can email me, jorey@herschercorp.com, or you can find me at jorey.us, www.jorey.us. And I'd love to talk to you.
Very good. But thanks everyone for coming. Once again, we appreciate this chance to explore the authentic version of who we can be as men, and look at our best options for really a self-actualized life. Maximize who you are and what your potential is to become. And on that note, we will look forward to talking to you guys next time. Thank you.